tyrants of England, your race may soon be run. You may be brought into account for what you've sorely done.
In 1838, the London Working Men's Association published the People's Charter. Its demands included the right to vote and the secret ballot. The Charter quickly became the focus of a great national campaign, supported by millions and running for over a decade. But at the heart of the Charter, there was a fundamental flaw. The very first of its 6 points didn't call for universal suffrage, but for universal male suffrage, a vote for all men. This democratic deficit was noticed very quickly, and when the Working Men's Association circulated drafts of the Charter to radical organisations all over the country, many wanted to see women accorded their political rights. The London Working Men's Association conceded the argument, but stood firm. Later editions noted, "Against this reasonable proposition we have no just argument to adduce," but it maintained that many men would oppose a wider right to vote if that meant enfranchising women as well as men. This was an argument that William Lovett, who drew up the Charter, came to regret. Towards the end of his life in the 1870s, he wrote, "I may here state that the first draft of the bill, afterwards called the People's Charter, made provision for the suffrage of women, but as several members thought its adoption in the bill might retard the suffrage of men, it was unfortunately left out." Despite this, and even in an era when women had few legal rights of any kind, women flocked to the Chartist cause. Sometimes, however, they made clear that they too felt they had the right to the elective franchise. In 1839, when the first Chartist petition was presented to Parliament, women made up 1 in 10 of the 1,280,000 signatures. In some parts of the country, notably the Chartist strongholds of Carlisle and Ashton-under-Lyne, it was 1 in 5. It is worth noting, incidentally, that far fewer people had the vote, considerably less than 1 million, than had signed the petition. As subsequent petitions grew in size, so the number of women who signed also grew. And though as far as we can tell there was no increase in the percentage of signatures from women, it stayed at around 10%. Large numbers of women also subscribed to join the Chartist Land Company, which had around 1,200 women among its 40,000 plus members, all of whom, incidentally, are named in the Chartist Ancestors Databank. Women also played more active public roles in Chartism. Many took part in the processions and monster meetings organised in support of the Charter. I can't reproduce it here for copyright reasons, but Google photos of the meeting held on Kennington Common on 10th of April 1848. If you look closely at the 2 daguerreotypes of the crowd, among the men in flat caps and top hats, you will also see women in their white bonnets and shawls, some standing in the crowd and others on the great carts that served as platforms for the speakers. Women were frequently called on at these great outdoor events to present visiting speakers with silk scarves, ribbons and rosettes, often their own work, as weavers were strongly represented in the Chartist ranks, especially in the north of England, but they seldom, if ever, got the opportunity to speak from the platform. There were, however, Chartist women's organisations. The National Charter Association was unique at the time in allowing men and women to join on the same terms, but there were also as many as 200 specifically women's radical societies and Chartist groups. One, the Birmingham Female Political Union, could claim 3,000 members. Some women's organisations had their roots in the campaigns against the workhouse system. At Carlisle in September 1838, for example, a very crowded meeting of females formed a Women's Radical Association to fight for the People's Charter and against the new Poor Law. A few weeks later, more than 200 of its members marched behind their new banner at a procession in support of the Chartist petition. Such organisations weren't afraid to take direct action. When a Poor Law Commissioner visited Elland near Leeds in February 1838, members of the local Female Radical Association rolled him in the snow before running him out of town. You will not be surprised to hear that politicians and newspapers that opposed the Charter were especially horrified by the very idea of women Chartists. Some male Chartists did want women to have the vote, and there were notable husband and wife Chartist partnerships, including Charles and Elizabeth Neeson in East London and Abram and Elizabeth Hanson at Elland in Yorkshire. But this was not the whole story. Many men took a condescending approach to the idea of women's political rights. Fergus O'Connor, the Chartist leader, wrote that the woman's role was to be a housewife, to prepare meals, to wash, to brew, and look after my comforts and the education of my children. It's probably worth noting that O'Connor never married. Others at least addressed the issue, however badly. At a meeting of the City of London Female Charter Association in 1842, a Mr. Cohen, who described himself as a Chartist, declared that he did not consider that nature intended women to partake of political rights. How would a woman MP react if a male lover in the House were to try to sway her vote, he asked. He was slapped down by Mary Ann Walker, one of the platform speakers, who declared that she would treat with womanly scorn as a contemptible scoundrel the man who would dare to influence her vote by any undue and unworthy means. For some months, the activities of the City of London Female Chartists were a media sensation, and its members the subjects of mockery and denigration. The Times dubbed them she-chartists or hen-chartists, and Punch caricatured Mary Ann Walker as a sharp-faced, angry harridan. Others judged female politicians as against nature, and one paper declared, if it were possible to get rid of the disgust occasioned by seeing English women, the daughters, sisters or wives of somebody, exhibiting themselves in this fashion before a set of ragged, reeking fellows in a dirty corner of the Old Bailey, there would be something exceedingly amusing in the mock gravity of the proceedings. I'd like to briefly introduce you to three women who were involved in Chartism. The first is Susanna Inge, whose photo you can see here. The daughter of a plumber, she grew up mostly in London, getting little education and until the age of 16 being able to read but not write. Her job as a finisher for a furrier had little use for educated workers. Even so, she was the driving force behind the City of London Female Chartist Association and served as its secretary for 2 years. Susanna's ambition was to be a writer, but she had little success in getting her work into print. In the 1850s, she emigrated to America, and for decades afterwards wrote long letters back to her family in London, enclosing poems and even the draft of a novel she'd written. May Paris was born in a small Scottish seaside village and married a blacksmith from the next town. Unfortunately, we have no photograph of her. The couple moved to Greenwich, and for some years, even as their family grew, they were both active Chartists. May was especially remembered for her work in collecting large numbers of signatures for the 1842 petition. Meetings of the local branch of the Chartist Land Company met at her home, but sadly she died in the 1849 cholera epidemic. Finally, Helen Macfarlane. Her father had owned a textile mill, but the business failed, and when he died, Helen had to find work as a governess to support herself. As a result, she found herself in Vienna in the spring of 1848, when revolutions were sweeping Europe. After her return to England, she wrote regularly for Chartist newspapers, the Red Republican and Friend of the People. She was the first person to translate the Communist Manifesto into English, and both Marx and Engels were admirers. Many of her articles drew on Hegelian philosophy and theology. Helen married and had a child, but sadly both her husband and child died when the family emigrated to South Africa. Helen returned and married a clergyman, ending her life as the wife of a Church of England vicar in rural Cheshire. After 1848, Chartism went into decline, having failed to win the demands set out in the People's Charter a decade earlier. It would not be until 1928 that all men and women could vote. Even so, some did not give up. In 1851, the Sheffield Women's Rights Association took up the struggle. Encouraged by Anne Knight, a Quaker and veteran campaigner for the abolition of slavery, they organised the first ever petition to Parliament calling for women's right to vote. It was presented in both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and promptly rejected, just as the earlier Chartist petitions had been. There was a long fight ahead. If you'd like to know more about Chartism and the men and women who were part of it, please visit my website at chartistancestors.co.uk. Thank you for watching.
Now we're brought down to poverty, to sorrow and distress, and when at night we go to sleep in bed we cannot rest. We must never be no better till the victory is won. Don't you see provisions are kept up by bayonet and gun? You tyrants of England, your race may soon be run. You may be brought into account for what you've sorely done.